While Europe watches France and Germany wrestle over policy, Denmark just pulled off another quiet masterstroke. It's not about tanks, treaties, or headlines. It's about leverage. Political, economic, and financial. While most of Europe's attention is elsewhere, Denmark just took control of the EU presidency, launched a financial move no one expected, and pushed legal pressure where the EU wouldn't, and no one's talking about it. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth one power shift at a time. If you track capital flows, influence maps, and silent power moves, subscribe. Let's break it down. In July 2025, Denmark quietly stepped into one of the most powerful roles in the European Union, and almost no one noticed. As the rotating president of the EU Council, Denmark now controls the legislative agenda for 6 months. For most countries, it's ceremonial. For Denmark, it's strategic. Almost immediately, it began shifting the bloc's priorities, pushing forward long-stalled security coordination, championing stricter fiscal discipline, and, most notably, pressing for legal action against Hungary under Article 7. That article, long dormant, allows the EU to suspend a member state's voting rights for violating democratic principles. And while Brussels hesitated, Copenhagen advanced. This wasn't a fluke. It was the culmination of a strategy built on rules, reputation, and readiness. Denmark, a country of fewer than 6 million people, has found ways to amplify its influence in a system that often bends toward the biggest players. Rather than compete with France or Germany for headlines, Denmark competes for control of process and wins. Its presidency agenda reads like a masterclass in soft power. Improve EU defense procurement, deepen coordination on Ukraine, and ensure fiscal responsibility isn't sidelined in the name of political expediency. And unlike louder members, Denmark's credibility comes from consistency, both in law and in numbers. In a time when larger states are bogged down by internal politics or diplomatic ambiguity, Denmark has become the unexpected driver of EU cohesion. Not because of brute force or budget size, but because it knows how to work the system from within. And in this case, the smallest voice is steering the largest stage. While much of the European Union wrestles with inflation, deficits, and stalled growth, Denmark stands apart, not by accident, but by design. In 2024, while several EU economies flirted with recession, Denmark posted GDP growth of 3.7%, the highest among advanced economies in the region. Even more striking, the country ran a 4.5% government budget surplus, a figure almost unthinkable for nations mired in deficit spending. And these weren't flukes. The IMF projects Denmark will continue outpacing much of the continent through 2026, even as it ramps up public investment in defense and green infrastructure. This gives Denmark quiet authority. While other EU members debate new stimulus packages and expanded borrowing rules, Denmark becomes the living counterexample. A nation proving that fiscal responsibility and economic growth aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they can be mutually reinforcing when paired with competent institutions and clear policy frameworks. This contrast is more than symbolic. It creates a political and economic tension within the EU. Larger states push for looser debt rules, while Denmark and its Nordic peers argue for stricter enforcement, not to penalize, but to protect the long-term credibility of the Union. And here's the real twist. Denmark is using its current presidency to reinforce this philosophy. By emphasizing financial discipline at the EU level, it subtly redirects power away from debt-heavy governments and toward countries that have maintained structural balance. It's not a populist rebellion. It's technocratic leverage used to shape the rules of the game without breaking them. In the process, Denmark doesn't just avoid Europe's fiscal crisis, it quietly becomes the benchmark for how to prevent the next one. While the EU's biggest economies debate funding mechanisms for Ukraine and wrangle over military-industrial integration, Denmark moved fast and first. In June 2025, it became the first country to operationalize the EU's $300 million export guarantee scheme for Ukraine. The program, designed to de-risk European exports into Ukrainian markets, had stalled in Brussels. But Denmark stepped in, signed on, and launched it ahead of Germany, France, or Italy. This wasn't just a show of support. It was a strategic move, one that signals to both markets and allies that Copenhagen understands the new financial battlefield. Export guarantees are not just humanitarian tools. They are economic diplomacy weapons. By being first, Denmark earns the trust of Ukrainian firms, EU exporters, and private insurers, all while amplifying its own position as a gateway to post-war reconstruction capital. This isn't new behavior. Denmark has long mastered capital efficiency, using smaller sums to create outsized geopolitical impact. Instead of massive defense budgets or flashy bailouts, it focuses on targeted interventions that signal competence and commitment. Whether in vaccine logistics, climate funding, or now Ukraine's economic reboot, Denmark's model is the same. Move early, act cleanly, and gain leverage through trust. As the EU faces fragmentation between North and South, East and West, Denmark is exploiting the vacuum with quiet execution. It's not just helping Ukraine, it's helping shape the new rules for how European capital engages with fragile frontiers. While others make announcements, Denmark makes moves. And in this case, outsmarting the EU didn't require size, just timing, clarity, and the confidence to act when others hesitate. It's easy to overlook infrastructure until you realize it's where real power lives. Ports, energy grids, railways, digital corridors, these are the arteries of modern economies. And Denmark, without fanfare, has embedded itself deep into this space across Europe. Through its partnerships with the European Investment Bank, EIB, Denmark has helped finance over 25.6 billion euros in projects across 336 initiatives. But it's not just the scale, it's the positioning. These projects are surgical. Denmark backs cross-border logistics, green energy storage, and digitized transport corridors that link Northern Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. In essence, Denmark is helping build the next layer of Europe's physical economy while ensuring it sits at the center of those supply chains. What's more telling is how Denmark uses the EIB as a multiplier. By co-financing projects rather than trying to control them, it spreads influence without inviting resistance. It also avoids the political paralysis often seen in larger member states. Denmark's infrastructure footprint is expanding, not because it's pushing nationalism, but because it's pushing functionality. And in today's Europe, execution is influence. This quiet engineering goes beyond construction. It shapes energy independence, resilience, and connectivity. The very themes dominating EU summits. Yet while Paris and Berlin draft communiques, Denmark delivers cables, bridges, and hydrogen terminals. It's a reminder that infrastructure isn't just steel and cement. Denmark has positioned itself not just as a participant in Europe's future build-out, but as an indispensable architect. One that moves beneath the headlines, but above the grid lines. In the European Union, power doesn't always come from armies or money. Sometimes it comes from rules. And Denmark has quietly become one of the bloc's most effective legal engineers. Case in point, its leadership in reviving Article 7 proceedings against Hungary, the so-called nuclear option of EU law, which allows the suspension of a member state's voting rights for violating democratic principles. For years, Article 7 sat dormant. Political infighting and diplomatic hesitation rendered it symbolic at best. But in 2025, under Denmark's EU Council presidency, that changed. Denmark renewed the push to hold Hungary accountable for judicial interference and media suppression, not through threats, but through procedure. By framing the move as a defense of EU law rather than a political attack, Denmark made the case unassailable and forced the conversation back onto the EU agenda. This is Denmark's legal style, not loud, but lethal. It doesn't politicize compliance, it formalizes it, and by doing so, it sets a precedent. The message to illiberal governments is clear. The EU may move slowly, but under Denmark's watch, it moves intentionally. And it's not just about Hungary. Denmark's influence is felt across regulatory reform, digital privacy rulings, and environmental governance. It consistently aligns with the European Court of Justice, strengthens the role of EU treaties, and positions itself as the guardian of the rules-based order from within. In a union where enforcement is often as important as vision, Denmark has become the enforcer. Not with power plays, but with procedural precision. It's lawfare without warfare, and it's working. Beneath Denmark's political precision lies a deeper source of influence, its capital markets, specifically its pension system. Denmark manages one of the most advanced and powerful pension frameworks in the world, with assets exceeding 200% of its GDP. But what makes it geopolitically relevant is how it's now using that capital to pressure the entire EU financial system. In 2025, Denmark's top pension groups began openly challenging EU financial frameworks, warning that unless European regulations catch up to global competitiveness, capital will continue flowing to US markets. This isn't an empty threat. Danish pensions have increasingly allocated to US infrastructure and tech equity not for ideology, but because the EU lacks efficient investment structures, common reporting standards, and growth incentives. So Denmark's financial sector is now urging the EU to act, to build what it calls a growth-friendly sovereign capital union. The argument? Europe is losing its own money not to foreign buyers, but to its own inefficiencies, and Denmark is leading the call to fix it. This gives Copenhagen rare influence, not just as a capital allocator, but as a capital architect. When Denmark speaks on pensions or capital flow, Brussels listens, because few countries combine macro stability, demographic strength, and institutional trust the way Denmark does. It's another example of how Denmark uses scale intelligently. Its pensions don't dominate markets, but they signal trends, shape regulatory priorities, and spotlight what the EU is failing to protect, its own capital sovereignty. This is financial statecraft without confrontation, and once again, Denmark is the player no one saw coming, but everyone needs to follow. In a bloc often dominated by rhetorical flash and policy paralysis, Denmark's approach is almost the opposite. And that's exactly why it works. It doesn't try to outshout France or outmaneuver Germany. Instead, it plays the long game, showing up early, executing cleanly, and trusting credibility to do the talking. There's no grand ideology here. Denmark isn't trying to reinvent the European Union. It's trying to keep it functional. And that clarity has become a superpower. While other nations cycle through political crises, Denmark offers predictability. While others compromise on fiscal rules or legal principles, Denmark enforces them. And while others chase influence through headlines, Denmark wins it through results. Part of this is cultural. Nordic governance thrives on trust, transparency, and institutional restraint. But part of it is strategic. Denmark understands something most of the EU forgot. Power is cumulative. It builds through consistency, not spectacle. Think about what's already in play. Denmark leads the Council agenda. It shapes pension policy. It acts first on Ukraine export guarantees. It manages infrastructure financing across 25 billion euros in EIB projects. It reinforces EU legal norms without politicizing them. And all of this is done with fewer people than some European cities, and a capital city most newsrooms can't even pronounce. But that's the advantage. Denmark doesn't need attention to gain influence. It thrives under the radar. Because when you consistently deliver on process, values, and stability, people start listening, not because they're forced to, but because they realize you were right all along. Denmark didn't outspend, outsize, or outvote the EU. It simply outperformed it, in silence. Through legal enforcement, fiscal consistency, capital strategy, and institutional trust, it's carved out a position few expected. Not just a model European, but a blueprint for how the EU could actually function. And now Brussels faces a choice. It can dismiss Denmark's model as a small country exception, or it can study it as a scalable solution. Because the reality is, many of Europe's current crises, fiscal fragmentation, legal inconsistency, capital flight, are not resource problems. They're governance problems. And Denmark, quietly, has been solving them for years. This doesn't mean turning every country into Denmark, but it does mean taking seriously the systems that work. Denmark's early deployment of Ukraine export guarantees proves speed is possible. Its management of pension capital shows financial strategy doesn't have to be politicized. Its leadership in the Council presidency shows even small states can set a meaningful legislative tone when they act with clarity. The rest of Europe should be asking, what would it take to replicate Denmark's results? Not in culture, but in structure, in rules, incentives, and execution. Because Denmark didn't win the future by accident. It built the conditions for it. In a Europe tired of drama and division, Denmark offers something radically different: competence. And the greatest risk for the EU isn't that Denmark gets too powerful. It's that no one else learns from it. The next quiet victory is already being engineered. And if you're not watching Copenhagen, you're missing where the real game is being played. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is Denmark setting the standard for EU leadership, or exposing how fragile the system really is? Either way, the balance is shifting. This was Denmark outsmarted the EU again, and no one's talking about it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.